Hello everyone and welcome to an interesting kind of video. Today we are here on the Hypixel forums. Some of you might know this place. Crazy, I know. Gonna show some insane Hypixel forum gameplay here. But really what I'm doing here is looking at some Skyblock suggestions. We are going to see what exactly some people on the forums have been suggesting for the game, and I'll be sharing my own thoughts about it, because why not? I play Skyblock, I use the forums. Might as well do a video combining the two. Now, I'll primarily be looking at suggestions that I haven't already seen, just so I can give my own immediate thoughts on what it is. I also won't be looking at any specific ones in particular. I'll just be choosing whatever one sounds interesting. And what is more interesting than Duck Cosmetic? We'll see what this is. I guess that's all, really. There should be a cosmetic duck block that you can place on your island. It doesn't have to do anything, I just think a duck would be funny. Well, there you go. Ducks in Skyblock. I guess. This probably makes the most sense here. If this were to be added, I'm guessing it would just be some sort of furniture in the summer cosmetic bundles. But honestly, I don't really care, because I can't get those. Now, what is the next one? Allow us to frag wither goggles and give them a rarity upgrade. The frag doesn't even need to give stats, just make us able to have a mythic wither goggles, please. I guess, maybe. As long as all the other class-themed items from Ophelia's shop also get this, then sure, why not? Now the real question is, why is this under cosmetics? Because having a rarity upgrade is definitely not cosmetic. There's also the question of what exactly would be used to frag this. If I had to guess, probably laser eyes. And then to frag the other things from Ophelia's shop, you'd probably need the different class-based precursor relics. Not that it would really make any difference for anything except wither goggles, because that's the best out of those 5, but just something to consider so there's like some sort of consistency. And next, world bosses and weeklies. So I got into World of Warcraft because of my dad, and I'll be honest, I only play because he likes to do the dungeons with all of us. But the game is generally so boring and there's absolutely no intensity whatsoever. It's just a button mashing simulator, but it did have a couple really good ideas for an MMO that would be dope if implemented into Skyblock, and give us something to do alongside already current events. So it kind of already exists as a concept within Skyblock, with Mayor events and other uncommon events. But if there are things such as world bosses that show up for a week every month, there's an assortment of 6 that could show up, each has rare loot, but good loot, and it could be for very endgame players. And then also weeklies. World of Warcraft has a system that's kind of cool where you get 3 new quests a week that give you powerful gear. The problem with implementing just giving good gear off the bat in Skyblock is it would mess up progression, or the gear likely just wouldn't match where you are in progression. So what if weeklies were kind of like Crystal Nucleus runs, where you can do it once or twice a week for a chance to get rare crafting resources to make powerful gear, but all of which varies in progression. And the last idea is pretty much just world bosses but for dungeons. Add 6 to 8 new dungeons that are unique and cool and special, all 3 of those, it has to be all 3, but show up like for a week out of a month, and is on a rotation of dungeons. I don't know, I think things like Mythos event are really cool and mixes things up, so having something else like that would be cool. There are a few concerns regarding an idea like this. So first of all, if there were to be really good bosses that give really good loot, if it shows up only 1 week every month, the loot they drop should not be rare because of how time gated that already is. And 2, if the devs do put a lot of work into making these boss fights, they should just be in the game instead of being time gated. If they are just in the game, that means the loot can be rarer because players can do it over and over again, and those bosses will just be a part of content that players can still play even if it isn't that 1 week of a month. And that already exists in the game through Slayers. So if anything, they should just be more Slayers, really, at the end of the day. If you want things that require more cooperation, there are already those in Skyblock 2, and those are the already existing world bosses. And the way those function are kind of okay. The frequency at which you can spawn them is pretty fine. The actual mechanics of the boss are questionable, and that's just regarding all the bosses. Whether or not they're fun or interesting is dependent on the player, but the point is it doesn't take a week for them to spawn, and players can technically do them repeatedly over and over again. If more world bosses were to be added, I really don't think they should be time gated to a week every month, and instead just be naturally difficult to do. And that way it could still be geared to endgame players without being time gated, and the content will just be available in the game at all times. And now on to weeklies. This isn't a terrible system either, it just probably shouldn't give gear. There have already been a lot of suggestions before about a Questmaster, which exists in other games on Hypixel. Every week or every day, depending on which quest you want to do, you can accept the quest, do whatever the quest asks, and then you get XP and coins from it. And that same system could very easily be implemented into Skyblock. Whether it gives coins or not, it could be arguable, but there could be different quests that gives XP for different skills. And again, that kind of already exists in the forms of commissions for mining, faction quests for combat, and I think that's kind of it. So if anything, more of those kinds of things should be added. But if you do want it to be like a more generalized thing, there could be a similar mechanic to the faction mechanic, but just better, because factions are a mess, in my opinion, personally. Have that somewhere in the hub, and then you can accept daily or weekly quests, complete those, and then get skill XP based on what the skills are that you're focusing on. Maybe some cosmetic stuff? Possibly. And also maybe a form of quest XP that you can use specifically to level up whatever level of what that quest mechanic would be. And then as you level up in that mechanic, you can get better quests and better rewards from that. And of course, it doesn't just have to be cosmetics and XP. It could be other things like different materials based on what type of quest it is. Maybe you could get some sort of accessory that scales with rarity based on how many quests you complete. Overall though, I guess it's kind of similar to what this suggestion is, but add daily quests and make it a little more full, if that's the right word for it. A daily and weekly quest system already exists for other games on Hypixel, so kind of just take that idea, put it into Skyblock, and make it its own mechanic possibly. And I think that could work pretty well, pretty simply, and shouldn't be too out of the box compared to what Skyblock already has. And the last thing, world bosses, but for dungeons. So the thing to consider is, it took so long for one dungeon to be added. I don't know how long it's going to take for 6 to 8 new dungeons to be added, but it's definitely going to take much longer than you think it is. If you mean 6 to 8 new dungeon floors, that's still going to be very long. It's going to take a lot of time. And if that did happen, which I'm sure at some point in the future, the desert or the jungle dungeon will come out, maybe, possibly, and when those do, they're definitely not going to be available only for a week out of the month. If 6 to 8 new dungeons or new dungeon floors were added, they would be permanent content because it would be such a waste of resources to only have them available once a week out of a month. Kind of the same idea as the bosses only showing up once a week out of every month. That's just not how the game should function, in my opinion. Yes, we do have things like Mares where Mythos, fishing festivals, and mining fiestas are all locked behind time-gated content, and that just is what it is. Personally, I don't really agree with it, but that's just how it is, really. And even though those are in the game, I don't think that means we should add more of it to the game. Especially if it's going to be like a whole new dungeon, pretty much. Like, that should just be in the game permanently so players can just play it. Still, I don't fully disagree with everything here, but I more so agree with the idea of adding more content to the game, in a way, but more playable content that isn't time-gated. And next, combat and spawning revamp. I believe that you should not have to be punished if another player is in the same area killing the same mobs. In this example, I will use the Howling Caves and the Sven's Lair. The more people in the area, the more mobs should spawn seems like common sense, but it stays the same. At least that's what it feels like. Unrelated, but the wolves need to drop more XP. There are 2 options to fix this. One, have a multiplier, so the more people in an area, the more mobs spawn. And not just the people on the island, just the people in the certain areas where abuse can be countered, be making it... What? Where abuse can be countered, be making it so only actively killing them will count. 2, make some mobs client-side and not server-side, so everyone has their own mobs. This one is less viable because it's much more easy to abuse and might cause lag. I don't really know how it would work, but just an idea. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. Now, I personally have also suggested something similar, just not as a base mechanic, but instead as an accessory. And for every player that has that accessory in a lobby, mobs will spawn at a certain percent faster rate. I think it was 0.2? No, I think it was 2%, right? Maybe. 2 or 1%. And so for every player that had that accessory in their accessory bag, it would increase the spawn rate of all mobs up to, I think it was like 10 players. And so it would increase the spawn rate by 10 to 20% if there were 10 people that had that accessory in one lobby. Now, I don't know if my own idea is exactly the best solution to this, but I think either this idea needs to happen, or there should just be new areas players can use to spawn their slayers. We've kind of seen this already, at least in the Crimson Isles with the Spider Slayer. You can kill the flaming spiders there, and that would be primarily for late to end game players, while mid and early game players would most likely still be on the spider's den. And that way it kind of separates players that are killing things faster, and that way weaker players can still kill mobs to get XP to spawn their slayers, while stronger players are rewarded for being stronger, and so they can kill more difficult mobs, get more XP, and they just have to kill less mobs because they're getting more XP. Honestly, I think that's the best solution, but it definitely takes a lot more work. You need to create new areas, create new mobs, balance out the XP rate so it's not too broken, but that's definitely what I think is the best solution, instead of just increasing how many mobs spawn in an area. But either way, I do agree this needs to be fixed, especially regarding Sven, because the only place to grind them is either the ruins in the hub or the Howling Cave, and you have no other options. So yeah, that does make it slightly difficult, slightly bothersome, which is why I don't do Svens. But yes, arguably good idea, but it's definitely a problem that should be addressed somehow, some way. And it seems I did get a quote, so we'll see what the reply is. Honestly, they should just be base legendary to keep consistency with the Mender line. Is Mender Crown legendary? I did not know that. Mender Crown is not legendary. Maybe the wiki is outdated? Perhaps, maybe? If I check the fandom wiki. Nope, it's still epic rarity. If Mender Crown were base legendary rarity, that would make the most sense. But it is not, so it wouldn't exactly be consistent. I mean, if anything though, the rarity of all those items should just be increased, so that they are base legendary. Yeah, now that I think about it, there really is no reason why they shouldn't just be base legendary, because they are the tier 3 version, and the rarity progression from tier 1 is rare, epic, epic again for some reason. So they should really just be base legendary to begin with. Now, next, what do I need for Enderman? What do I need for Enderman with a budget of 300 mil? We have a lost forumer here. This is not where you ask for help regarding Skyblock. If you have questions or you need help with anything, you should instead go to the section that says help. Skyblock community help. Go there. Ask questions there. The Skyblock suggestion and feedback section is for suggestions and feedback about the game. I'm sure most people know that. I'm just mentioning that here just because I still see that sort of thread pretty frequently in this section. Next, Foraging Island Boss. Somewhat high effort. Alright, this is going to be a long one. I don't know if I'm going to read everything, but I will at least read some of it. Yeah, some of it. With the new upcoming foraging update, I was wondering about what type of a boss, similar to Kudra, might be added to the new foraging island. Then I was thinking about a potential boss until I had this idea. So here I am now proposing an idea for a new boss, and the type of stuff we can expect to get from it. Unlocking the boss, similar to Kudra, to fight said boss requires the player to do a quest given to them by an NPC in the forest. The story is that the forest has an abundant amount of aether, which allows the trees to be able to regrow once they have been chopped down or have died naturally. However, there have been sightings of trees that have died and have not been regrowing or regenerating in the forest. The quest line will lead the player to find a dead tree around the forest, and the player will have to investigate why the trees are dying. During the side quest, it would be discovered that the trees seem to have had the aether sucked dry from them, leaving them unable to regrow. When following a large trail from one of the dead trees, it leads to a cave entrance where the boss resides. The boss. When diving into the cave, it turns out that there is an overgrown centipede that has evolved to be able to drain the aether from the trees to grow. Now it has turned into a massive monster, that will destroy any living creature in sight. The task is for the player and a team to take down the monster. There are 5 tiers of said boss, which is harder than the last. Each tier is based on how old centipede is. The older the centipede is, the stronger and more resilient it becomes, as they have been consuming aether for much longer. Tier 1. The boss is in the very early stages of its life and has only recently gotten the ability to drain aether out of the trees. Don't let its age fool you, as it will rip you apart. Due to its only recent ability to drain aether from trees, it has little health and defense compared to its older counterparts. Also, due to lack of aether, it can be damaged by outside weapons, but the damage of said weapons is significantly reduced. Examples include Term, Claymore, any weapon that is not introduced in the update or boss, which I don't really think is a good idea, but we will address that later. Second tier, unlike its younger counterpart, this one has been absorbing aether for quite some time. As a result, its damage, HP, and defense have greatly increased compared to its younger brother. With the abundant amount of aether, it has gained the ability to negate most damage from items that are not gained from the update or boss. The only way to damage said boss is by using a weapon from the update. Tier 3, very similar to the second in terms of gameplay, but will have a stronger boss and better loot at the end of the run. Fourth tier will have the part 2 and part 3 portion of the boss fight. Fifth tier, this would be a stronger version of the fourth tier, and have the best drop chance / best loot available. The fifth tier also includes a mechanic where that spawns smaller centipede minions periodically that the player must deal with while battling the main boss. Boss abilities. Aether Drain. The centipede can release an aether draining aura that slowly drains life energy from players in the vicinity. Their health gets reduced, making them weaker over time. Players must periodically break their line of sight with the boss to avoid this effect. Bite Attack. The centipede can perform a powerful bite attack that deals high damage to players within its reach. Players don't need to dodge or block this attack using environmental cover or a shield. Aether Projectile. The boss can fire aether projectiles at players, which can be dodged or deflected using well-timed attacks. These projectiles deal damage and inflict a debuff that reduces the player's ability to regenerate health for a short time. Aether Infusion. As the boss evolves through its tiers, it becomes more adept at using aether to strengthen itself. It can periodically absorb aether from nearby tree roots, increasing its damage, defense, and healing abilities. Players must interrupt this process to prevent the boss from becoming too powerful. Boss Fight. Progressive Cave Chambers. Part 1, Entrance Chamber. The fight starts in a relatively open area where the centipede is first seen. The main objective is to damage it and kill it. If it is a tier 4 or 5, then this phase lasts until its health reaches 25% of its max HP. Once that happens, the centipede will try to retreat. Part 2, Narrow Passages. I am guessing this is only tier 4 to 5? Yes, it's only tier 4 to 5. The 4th tier will have part 2 and part 3 portions of the boss fight. So, part 2, Narrow Passages. The centipede retreats through narrow tunnels, forcing the player to follow. These passages have hazards like sudden traps, slippery surfaces, or steam vents. The player must parkour to follow the centipede. Mana-based teleportation like AOTE, AOTV, and Hype will not work here due to strong amount of aether in the air. If the player does not stay within a 50 block radius of the centipede, they will start to take damage from overexposure to poison in the air. The centipede has a natural immunity to poison that secretes an antidote in the air, which is why players will not be poisoned when near it. And part 3, Central Cavern, a large open chamber with a high ceiling, featuring bioluminescent fungi and aether crystals that will provide ambient light and unique environmental interactions. In the beginning of this area, the centipede will be sucking the aether from the roots of the tree to regain all of its health and become immune to all damage. During this phase, the player needs to stun the boss to deal damage to it, and there will be large dripstone/rock formations on the top of the cave that can drop onto the boss. Once it has been dropped on the boss, it will become stunned and unable to attack. Once the final hit is dealt, the boss has been slain, and the loot can be collected. Besides dropping large rocks on the boss, there are other interactive elements. For example, players can activate ancient machinery to create hazards for the boss or redirect aether flow to weaken it, and other things like that. Okay, so before I go on to the loot and new weapons, I will talk about the boss itself first. Okay, so first of all, I appreciate the actual lore included, it makes certain mechanics, make sense, and it adds a little more life to the world, and also, it means more things can be built off of this in reference to it. And so, unlocking the boss, again, I appreciate the lore. Pretty simple way to unlock the boss is just by, a quest line. Makes sense, nothing too much to say besides that. Now, the boss itself. Honestly, I think most of it is fine. It sounds pretty interesting. A giant centipede, I think, could definitely be possible as a boss fight, just because we have the, that worm lava sea creature? I forget what its name is. But since that exists, I feel like it should be possible to make that but a giant version. But what I do want to focus on is this part. Due to lack of either, it can be damaged by outside weapons, but the damage of said weapons is significantly reduced. So things like this, I feel like are very controversial in this community, especially since it takes so much time to get anything in this game past a certain point. And so making a boss completely immune to those things is just not really good, and it doesn't fully reward the player for getting those items. I've seen a lot of people talk about Revs being immune to magic damage, or Svens being immune to magic damage. I forget if they still are or aren't, but at some point they were immune. They might still be immune. Now, I know the first tier of the boss, it only takes reduced damage, but I don't think that specificity really matters in this case because it does get full immunity in later tiers. I just don't think that's necessarily a good idea. If anything, instead of completely negating the damage from other weapons, the new weapon should just be better for this specific thing. And that way, players still have a reason to get the new items. I mean, we've seen it with things like Enderman Slayer. Yes, you technically can use hype, but for the majority of players, Atom Split will be better just because it's such a good sword for Enderman Slayer, has a much lower cost, and even on the higher end of things, I'm pretty sure it can be better than RCM. Of course, you need an insane Crimson set, but it's useful before hype, and it's useful after hype. And so I feel like a similar thing could happen here. Make the weapons good before Term, before hype, before Dark Claymore, and they'll still have use, even if they don't end up being as good afterwards. And even then, they still might be good afterwards, depending on what your setup is, how strong the final tiers of those weapons are against the boss. Now, I understand balancing anything in this game is just so difficult with the inclusion of hype, of Term, of Dark Claymore, because they are the best weapons by a landslide. And as someone that also makes suggestions for the game, it's rough at the end of the day. But I also just think having mobs or enemies or whatever be immune to damage is also just a pretty boring solution. But that aside, I think the boss honestly functions pretty well on its own. It doesn't seem like anything too complex. It gets stronger based on tier. It has a melee attack, it has a range attack. The Aether Infusion is pretty cool. It adds a mechanic that kind of separates it from other bosses in the game. And it can give players some time to breathe in between the boss fight if they need that. Well, at least if it works the way I'm assuming it works. Because from what it sounds like, I'm guessing the boss stops attacking, uses Aether Infusion, and players can interrupt that infusion to prevent it from gaining more strength, pretty much. That's what I'm thinking. And during that time, players can heal up if they need to. Well, I guess that's all really. Maybe replace down deployables if they have to. But it's still good to give players a little bit of time during the boss fight to rest their fingers, I guess. Now, regarding the chambers, the entrance chamber is pretty self-explanatory. It's just a boss arena. Part 2 is also pretty self-explanatory. I do think it's good to disable teleportation. Even though I was talking about items shouldn't be completely negated, I think regarding teleportation items, that's kind of needed for something like this. Which again is unfortunate, but just the existence of ALTE, of ALTV, that level of freedom in mobility just completely nullifies any challenge that doesn't have them disabled in. Imagine if you could teleport 2 terminals in F7. Imagine if you could teleport 2 chests in the trap room. Imagine if you could just teleport through the parkour in the jungle temple. Teleportation kind of needs to be disabled for certain things like that, just because of how much utility it gives outside of that. And then part 3, Central Cavern. I think immunity here is okay, only because it's all weapons and it's part of the mechanic, but something I do think should happen is it should have some sort of toughness bar. Sort of, I guess, like a hit shield, kind of like how Enderman Slayer does. Give it a hit shield that breaks immediately when it's hit with a rock, but hitting it with weapons will still slowly reduce the shield. I don't think it would change too much about the boss fight. It would give a slight amount of reward for attacking the boss if you choose to, but hitting it with a rock or some other hazard thing in the area is still the best way. And now, on to loot. Etheric Essence, used to upgrade weapons and armor, add stars to weapons, items to craft new weapons, and that's it, I guess. New weapons. In this boss fight, the new weapons are introduced as ways to attack the boss. These weapons will be a nice way to introduce new weapons for certain classes that can be used during the progression of the game. Base weapon, Arcane Longshot Staff. Special ability, Arcane Bolts. Charges up and fires a single powerful arcane bolt over a long distance when you hold down the attack button. And the damage scales based on how long you hold the button, max 5 seconds, and costs 50 mana. Then the Mystic Barrage Staff, which is the upgrade to the previous one, fires multiple rapid arcane bolts in quick succession, creating a spread effect that can hit multiple targets or saturate a single one with damage. And then Arcane Burst triggers an arcane burst, releasing a burst of energy at close range that damages and knocks back enemies. And then Astral Flare Staff, the third upgrade. Left-click ability, Astral Flare, fires a single immensely powerful arcane bolt that deals massive damage upon impact, making it ideal for taking down tough, high-health enemies. The damage scales based on how long you hold down the button, max 5 seconds. And right-click ability, Arcane Nova, unleashes a devastating explosion of arcane energy that damages and stuns nearby enemies, effective for controlling groups of foes, 5-second cooldown. And now, Ethereal Hunter Bow Enchanted. Ethereal shots now pierce through even more enemies. Wait, is there not a base one of this? Ethereal shots now pierce through even more enemies, dealing increased bonus damage to each target hit. I feel like there's supposed to be a base item of this, unless this is the base item. Because it's saying, now pierces through even more enemies. Maybe? I'm not sure. But I'm also assuming this is a longbow. I feel like we do need better longbows in the game, but it's also like, how do you make one compete with any short bow, really? And then Ethereal Hunter Bow Celestial. Arrow's bonus damage to enemies is significantly increased, and the arrow has a chance to explode upon hitting an enemy, dealing area damage to nearby foes. And then Ethereal Hunter Bow Eternal. Arrows fired by this bow have a high chance to pierce through all enemies in their path, dealing devastating damage, and enemies hit by Ethereal Shot now have their defenses temporarily reduced, making them more vulnerable to incoming damage for a short duration, while also having the chance to explode upon hitting an enemy, dealing area damage to nearby foes. Alright, so starting back at loot, Etheric Essence. Personally, I think Essence is fine, but I'm not sure how I feel about Etheric Essence. Well, actually, never mind, I changed my mind. I think it's fine. I was thinking like, Essence usually follows a base material, but then we also have like Dragon Essence, we have Wither Essence, Undead Essence. So yeah, never mind. Etheric Essence is probably fine. I think it's fine. And then the weapons, I'd say definitely need some work on them, mainly the bows. Staffs are interesting. I think it should specify if it deals damage based on your melee damage or your intelligence with mana scaling, so I don't think that's exactly mentioned. I would assume it scales based on your intelligence and ability damage. And then, at least regarding this one, Arcane Longshot Staff, I guess just specify. Instead of saying special ability, have it like what the other ones say. Left click ability, I would assume that's what this one is. You hold down left click and it shoots a beam for up to 5 seconds. And then the mana cost should also be, I'm guessing per second, maybe? But yeah, overall, pretty good idea. The boss itself seems pretty cool. I don't know if it's as in-depth as something like Kudra, but maybe that's a good thing. Could be a good introduction for like early game players going into the forging island and then being able to fight this cool boss, and then expect more stuff like that in content later down the line. I do think damage immunity is something that should be worked around if at all possible. But besides that, I think the boss fight is pretty good. The items, of course, could use a bit of work, but you already know that. Maybe just have a bit more clarification, at least in the first arcane staff. And yeah, that's mainly it. Not too bad. Also, I just realized that, the arcane longstaff and the other staffs, it only fires one bolt instead of holding it down and firing what I originally thought it was firing a beam. Kind of like Precursor Eye. Yeah, you would hold it down and it would fire a beam that deals damage per second. But I think this just fires one attack that deals increased damage if you hold it down long enough. So that was my bad. But that aside, the post is done, and not next, because it has already been quite some time, and so I think I will end the video here. Some interesting suggestions definitely, and I'm sure the forums will come up with many more interesting suggestions. Will I do another video about this? Maybe, possibly. We shall see in the future.